Welcome to the 21st Century Scientists Working Group career panel on all sorts of types of careers you can do with some kind of science background or science interest. I hesitate to say traditional and alternative because that sometimes implies like it privileges one type over another. We often think about academic positions as somehow being the traditional ones that people do with a science degree, but you know, there's lots of different cool things we can be thinking about today. One of the things you might have noticed is that those of us who are workshop organizers, we're the ones who have the creepy green faces on our sticker faces on our name tags. Those of us who are workshop attendees have been passing out index cards. And that's because there are two ways with which you guys will be able to interface with the panelists when it's time to get to the Q&A session. So one is, I've pulled up Twitter on my computer and noticed that some people are already engaging on Twitter and reporting about the workshop and live tweeting some of the things that we've done over the course of the morning. We would like to see more of that. We are videotaping this session. We will be archiving it and sharing it, making it publicly available. And you know, engaging on Twitter around these topics is a way that we can pull in the environment and maybe get questions from other people. So one of the ways that you can ask questions is you can tweet it with the hashtag 21SCI, so 21SCI. If you do that, I will see it, and then I can kind of choose from some of the awesome questions you're asking and then reflect them to our awesome panelists. If you don't have Twitter, that's still okay. You don't have to use Twitter in order to do it. That's what those index cards are for. That's a chance for you to ask some questions. And again, if you guys could actually, they're not going to see you if you're standing in the back, so if you could actually consider maybe standing, at least one of you, standing down towards the front. That way, if you have one and you need to pass it off to the side so that your question can get asked, you can see some of our, again, creepy green smiley face workshop organizers that will come and take the question from you. And that just gives me a chance to do some moderating in a way that doesn't disrupt all of the cool things that the panelists have to say. So it's kind of an experimental format. It's going to be weird. We'll see how well it goes, but we're going to give this a try as maybe a different way to make sure that we sort of prioritize the fact that we want to hear as much as possible for some of these cool people. So that said, I want to just briefly introduce them, and then what they're going to be doing is giving their sort of 4-minute version of their career life history, which is of course hard to do in only 4 minutes, but we're going to make them do it because we thought, why not make the panelists start with doing something really hard? I want to introduce our 4 really awesome panelists that I'm so excited agreed to do this with us. So we've got Dr. Miriam Goldstein, who is a legislative assistant to Congresswoman Jackie Speier, Associate Director for Research, Patricia Jones, Dr. Patricia Jones, who is Associate Director here at the Beckman Institute, Dr. George Chacko, who is the Director of Research Information Analytics in the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research, and Dr. Christine Herman, who is a freelance science journalist. And so without further ado, I will, Miriam, if you wouldn't mind starting with you, we will start to hear from them. After we've heard from all 4 of them on their stories, that's when we're going to open it up to Q&A. And you guys can already start asking questions now if you want. I'm going to be paying attention and moderating and asking them questions depending on what you guys put on Twitter and in some of these index cards.
I think I can even do this in less than 4 minutes, actually. Challenge accepted. Thank you for the introduction. Again, my name is Miriam Goldstein. Currently I am working basically as a policy staffer for Congresswoman Jackie Speier, who represents part of San Francisco and then just the parts of the San Francisco Peninsula south of the city, San Mateo County, in the San Francisco Bay Area. But I got here through a very twisty path. I majored in biology as an undergrad, then I worked in, environmental consulting, outdoor education, and there's a little jaunt in construction in Manhattan. And then, like you do, I went to grad school in oceanography to get a PhD because I decided that was what I wanted to do with my life. And I really enjoyed grad school. I liked my research project, which was on the Great Pacific Garbage Patch in the North Pacific. It's not actually an island, you can't go there. I'd be happy to talk about that off this panel if anyone wants. But then near the end of grad school, I started to see that I could not see a productive way forward staying in science, although I really liked science. And I'd be happy to talk about that reasoning as well if anyone is interested. But I started looking for what else I could do. And what else I had done in grad school was a lot of science communication. Particularly that was the heyday of online science communications. I did a lot of blogging and tweeting. Both just sort of yay marine science and more specifically about my own research. and sort of leverage those communication skills and the science into a policy fellowship on Capitol Hill through a program called the Knauss Sea Grant Fellowships. Some of you might have heard of the AAAS fellowships, which do the same. It's pretty much the same thing. I can also talk about that. And so I worked on the Hill for a year in the House Natural Resources Committee, Democratic side, for then Congressman Ed Markey of Massachusetts. And then he got elected to the Senate. So I worked in the Senate, in his Senate office. And then my fellowship was over and I wanted to stick around, so I got a job with Congresswoman Speier as what's called a legislative assistant. So basically, policy workhorse. Most of the people who have this job are 10 years younger than me and have no advanced degrees, just FYI. And so I cover now energy, environment, agriculture, transportation, science, non-defense technology, consumer protection, and anything else that comes up sort of in the nerdy world, which is a very common portfolio in the House of Representatives. And that is me. Did I do it in 4 minutes?
Yeah, I think just about.
Awesome.
All right, Dr. Jones.
Thank you. I guess I'd like to summarize my career in terms of the importance of good timing for things. So I did my bachelor's in psychology here at Illinois, and as an undergrad I got interested in engineering psychology or human factors, which is a blend of engineering and psychology. So against the advice of my psychology advisor, I went to engineering grad school, so I'm the only person I know with a bachelor's in psychology but a master's and PhD in industrial and systems engineering. And then I came back to Illinois as a tenure track faculty member in industrial engineering, and I got tenured in 1997. And then around 1999, I got married, got pregnant with my first child, and my husband and I both got job offers in California for me to go to NASA and for him to go to Apple. And so we did. And so kind of, it was sort of like, for me, my grad students had like all finished up, and I was gonna either write a lot of grants and start over and do another crop of people, or I was like, man, you know, at this point in my life, I've gotten my tenure, I feel good about stuff, and I'd like to make a bigger impact, not by training people one at a time, but kind of being with a bunch of other grown-ups doing cool engineering stuff. So NASA was really great. I was there for 11 years. And then when this Beckman job came up, it was like, well, my husband had finished at Apple, and my kids are getting older, and my family's in Chicago, so we came back here. And my twin sister, if you don't know, is a professor of chemistry here, and we live 4 blocks away from each other and walk to school every day. So for me, the choices I've made, I think, have been, you know, good career choices for me. I've really enjoyed the different things that I've done, but also with that comes, you know, kind of a dual consideration of your family situation. So it was great to be in California. My other 2 kids were born there, but it's really great that we're all back home in Illinois. And so that's kind of my story in short. Thanks.
Yeah, Dr. Chacko.
Yeah. So my career started in veterinary college in India. I got my degree, and along the way, I became interested in cell biology. So I extended that degree into another one on veterinary pathology, and then logically became interested in molecular and cell biology, and I came to the United States in 1989. So I got my PhD studying the activity of immune receptors in human lymphocytes, and then I extended that in some postdoctoral work, which is around the same, roughly around the same topic. And I started getting increasingly bored with what I was doing. I found it labor-intensive and monotonous. So I was at NIH then, and I wandered into the Center for Scientific Review, and I'd never heard of it before, and to my utter surprise, I was hired about 4 weeks later. And I spent the next 13 years there doing various things centered around peer review and program evaluation. And I came to the university last year to extend some of those interests in research evaluation. So in terms of my career, so around peer review, I was a scientific review officer in the immunology, biophysics, biochemistry, and bioengineering areas. For a while, I ran a group there. I was the chief of the bioengineering review group, and then after that, I started a new office of planning, analysis, and evaluation that was trying to understand, was centered around trying to understand how effective NIH's funding strategy was in terms of what kind of science it was enabling. So what I'm interested in now is measuring the state of research funding in the country, thinking of ways of how to measure how effective it is and what kind of societal impact it eventually has. And a larger question is whether science should be utilitarian, that is, it should serve a public purpose. We understand that, but should it also generate economic benefits to the local population? So the drivers on my trajectory, in general, I followed my curiosity and tried to avoid anything that I thought was monotonous. I was determined not to be an experimental biologist at a certain point. I found it horribly labor-intensive, monotonous, and incremental. I have a short attention span that may also account for why I've hopped from area to area. But in general, asking for more to do from whoever I worked with has helped because it's opened new doors, and that's why I'm here today. So I suspect that I'll be doing something completely different 5 years from now. But it's an exciting time to be in science, in research evaluation.
Hi everyone, I'm Christine, and so I'm a freelance science journalist right now. And so my path into science journalism, I started as in college I studied chemistry at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I came to U of I in 2007 to get my PhD in chemistry. And about my third year of grad school, I was kind of just hitting a lot of bumps in the road with my research, and I realized that I still like science, but I just didn't really like being in the lab as much as I thought I would. I thought I wanted to be a professor and do research. But when I thought about it, the things that I liked about grad school was just being able to learn a lot of cool stuff, and I liked doing the writing and the communicating. I liked giving talks about my research. I liked telling people about it, but I didn't actually like coming to the lab every day and doing it. Through a random series of events, I connected with the journalism department just to find out about if I could just take a class or something. And I took my first class in journalism with Jennifer Follows, who's one of the organizers of this workshop. And it was an intro to journalism class. And that year I also started writing for the Daily Illini student newspaper. And I sought out an opportunity to blog for a chemistry magazine called Chemical and Engineering News. And I actually blogged about non-traditional careers for chemists to kind of give myself an excuse to explore lots of different possible career paths for me that didn't involve being in the lab. And then that spring, with having a few writing samples through the Daily Illini, I applied for a science writing internship at Fermilab, and so I took a 3-month break from grad school, and that was my 4th year of grad school, and I was a science writing intern up at Fermi National Accelerator Lab up in Batavia, Illinois. So those early experiences basically sealed the deal for me. I was like, this is what I want to do. I want to be a science writer. So I decided to come back to the lab and finish up my PhD, and in that last year I also started freelancing, mostly for chemistry magazines and journals, and then I applied to the journalism program here. But partly that was because my husband got a job at the U of I, so I was like, well, if I'm going to be in the middle of Illinois, I can try to launch a career as a science writer and try to find things to do as a freelancer and kind of ramp up from where I had started freelancing. But then when I got into the program and I got a fellowship to attend and get my master's, I was like, hey, why not? And so I stretched out that program over 2 years. So I actually just finished up last May with my master's in journalism, and in my final semester I got an opportunity to do some radio stories, and I loved it. So I did a journalism internship up in Chicago last summer with Radio Health Journal, where I was producing health stories for the radio, and then I landed a job back in Urbana with the American Oil Chemists Society, and I was a science writer for their magazine called Inform Magazine. And I did that just from July through December of last year. And then I had a baby just in January, and I decided I want to go back to freelancing, and partly because I wanted to be writing for more general audiences instead of more like scientifically oriented audiences. I wanted to start moving in that direction. And so I still do some freelance work for chemistry journals, but I'm also seeking out opportunities in radio. And I had my first story as a freelancer with WILL last month. It was about a drug that was developed in a chemistry lab at the U of I, and it's just entered clinical trials. So I pitched that story to them. And so I'm at the very beginning of my freelance journalism career, but I'm enjoying it a lot so far.
Thank you, everyone. I heard that story on WILL. I remember hearing it and being like, that's Christine. That was really exciting, actually. So we have already a couple of great questions from Twitter, and so I'm going to be really selfish and start with mine because I think it might set the tone for the other 2 questions. And I'm the moderator, so I get to do that. So my question is actually kind of a general one that maybe a couple of you might be able to speak to. I'm kind of curious, in what ways have your career moves, some of the different career moves that you guys have made, been intentional? And in what ways at other points have they sometimes been more opportunistic, or can you talk about times in which they aren't always intentional? So I'm just kind of curious about like what motivates these different career moves that you guys have made. Yeah, go for it.
0 have been intentional, except for applying to grad school. I did that intentionally. So intentionality might not be a necessary ingredient. I don't know. It probably depends on your personality. But I pretty much just liked, you know, in the case of working in Congress, I just enjoyed the work. So I thought, well, I'll stick around if I can. Doesn't hurt that it tends to be thought of as a good resume builder, though.
I'm more of a planner, so you know, I applied to grad school, I got in, I applied for faculty jobs, I got a job here. When I was on the faculty, that's when I saw this job announcement from NASA, and my husband at the time was working at Wolfram, and one of his colleagues had gone to Apple and said, oh man, they're hiring, so if I recommend you and they hire you, I get a bonus. So John applied to Apple, and therefore I was like, oh, well, this interesting thing came up in NASA, so it was sort of opportunistic. You know, I didn't plan to leave Illinois to go to NASA, but it was sort of like the universe was saying, it's time for us to do a new adventure together, and so that's what we did. Also, by the way, when I interviewed at NASA, I was 2 weeks pregnant, and I didn't know it. So then when I actually accepted the job offer, I had to tell them I needed maternity leave right away, and they're like, okay, we have a program, so it's fine, you know. So, by the way, if anybody interested in NASA, they're a great place to work for. They're very into diversity and inclusion, and they have lots of accommodations and lots of great leadership programs.
Well, so I've always followed my curiosity, and then in the process of following it, you find that there's something else interesting to do. So I've never regretted any stage of my explorations, but there's always something more interesting to do. So you move on.
I guess I've been pretty intentional. Because all of my skills were in research up until I decided I wanted to be a science writer, I needed to seek out opportunities. So I guess my approach has been knock on lots of doors and see which one's open. And typically I found that one door leads to another. I'll just give one example. I took the journalism class my 3rd year of grad school, and there was an alumni who worked at Fermilab, and I did an informational interview with her, and then when I applied for the science writing internship, she already knew who I was. So it's like, oh, well, you know, it's like one thing kind of can lead to the next, oftentimes, I've found.
So to my mind, this next question actually does kind of follow from the first. One person asks, is the PhD and postdoc mechanism broken? Are we training an unsustainable amount of scientists, and what solutions can we create as we're moving forward, right? Because there are a lot of different types of careers available, not necessarily, unless you actually do some really intentional looking, though, that's not always clear. And certainly the pipeline towards academia is a whole other conversation that I think will be worth engaging in. So do any of you want to share your thoughts about that?
So when I was at NASA, it was super prestigious to have a PhD. Most of the people I worked with had a PhD. And in fact, everybody was very careful to put, you know, PhD on their business cards and their electronic signature. And then one of the guy that hired me at NASA ended up going to the FAA for a while, and it was really interesting to talk to him about the culture there. Okay, FAA is regulatory, so he's like, I had to get my class ring and always wear a tie, and always put PhD on my card, and also PhD SES because he was a member of the Senior Executive Service. And again, it was like, oh, he was Dr. Allard. You know, you had to call him by his doctor name. So I would say that, you know, in the some of the worlds that I've been in, having a PhD is an automatic ticket to status. And so, you know, if you want to go work in a government research lab, whether it's energy or NASA or something else, that can be very powerful.
Mostly people laugh when they find out that I have a PhD in oceanography. As I said, most of the people who have this level of job that I have in a congressional office are around like 25, 26, and have like a bachelor's in policy and have worked their way up from being an intern sort of through the ranks to being sort of this mid-level staffer. I have no regrets about my path, as I've enjoyed it all the way, but definitely don't do a PhD if you know you want to work at that level of science policy, because that's not the way. I certainly have many thoughts about the system which are not very well informed, but I can only tell you what my own experience was as I was nearing the end of grad school. I was 32 and had been married for 7 years, and my husband moved cross country for me once so I could do my PhD, and he's like, well, I'll move once more for you and quit my job again and get a new job, but like, I'm not gonna do it every 2 to 3 years. And I was like, well, that's fair. Can't really. He has his own career, not as a scientist. So, so the postdoc faculty thing just seemed totally, seemed like a good way towards sadness and divorce if I had really pushed that. So I looked actively for what else I could do. So I don't know if that defines as broken, but I think there's something about asking people in their late 20s and 30s to move every 2 to 3 years for like a 10-year period that is a very, very challenging situation that not a lot of people can necessarily do.
Okay. How many PhDs does it take? So, for me, I don't think the system's broken. My PhD was a wonderful time of discovery, so was my postdoc. I discovered that I didn't want to be a faculty member. It was an important discovery. I don't have anything against faculty members. I'm even married to one, but they were unique experiences, and during my doctoral studies, I learned to sort of grapple with some scientific problems. And my postdoc, I sort of broke myself on one problem after another, and then you sort of leave much better informed than when you started.
I'd say a similar thing to George. Like, I don't regret going the path I did, but I tell people, I mean, you do not need a PhD in science to be a science journalist, but it has not hurt me to have one in any way. It's helped me in most cases when it's come up, you know, when I've sought out opportunities. So, yeah, and I would say I learned a lot of things through the process.
What I'm really appreciating about what I'm hearing here are the ways in which, you know, a lot of the career moves we make, even if we make one particular move and we think it's going to set us on one trajectory, it's a process of discovery, right? And I think that for a lot of us, that's what the PhD serves at. Though I think we also can have conversations about the ways in which the process is very much broken and can, you know, privilege certain people and not, and potentially be not helpful to others. On sort of still along those lines, and then I have a question that will sort of get us on a different tangent. I have a question from someone from the audience that says, was your advisor supportive of your pursuit? And this is for everyone, but I think maybe slightly more directed at Christine. Was your advisor supportive of you pursuing alternative careers, particularly around journalism, but then also I think for Miriam working in policy? And what was the impact of their support or lack of support?
That's a really great question. I would have brought that up if I had more time in my spiel. I had a very supportive advisor. Not all professors would have allowed me to take 3 months off of grad school, stop my research, you know, and then disappear for 3 months and then come back. And he didn't know a lot about science writing, so he himself could not personally be a mentor for me, but I don't fault him for that because, I mean, you know, his experiences has been in academia. So he did try to connect me on occasion to journal editors and other people who might be able to help me. So I would say, yeah, I think it would be hard if I didn't have that support. And if I didn't have that support from him, I honestly probably would have left grad school. But he was willing to kind of work with me and help me get to where I wanted to be. Was there a second part to that question?
No, I think you were
Okay,
sort of answering.
yeah.
Yeah, you answered both parts. Anybody else?
I had a wonderful PhD advisor for the grad school research process, and he so kind of ignored my other activities benevolently, all the online communication stuff, which was fine by me. We did have some like rip-roaring good lab debates and good fun over science communication. I don't know what he thinks about the current, about what I ended up doing. I mean, I didn't ask him for support on that. And he, being a more traditional kind of scientist, would not probably have known how to give it. But I did have access to another community at my grad school that was a more interdisciplinary community, the Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation, which really encouraged this kind of branching out. So in my particular case, the overall grad school university community was supportive. And, sometimes I see when I dream about zooplankton and like think about all the different ways I know of identifying them that I don't use anymore, I kind of see my advisor's point. He's like, how could you leave the zooplankton? Which is sort of, so I guess that is pretty much my confusing non-answer there.
Anyone else?
Oh, when I was a professor, I had several students who left before they finished their PhD, and one woman who was a really great student came to me and said, "I'm so sorry, but my husband has finished his job here and I ran a ship and we went back to San Diego." And I'm like, "Well, of course you should do that. You shouldn't feel bad about it. It's your life. It's not just about me setting you on a path and me making you do stuff." So I feel like a good professor will be supportive about, the life choices the students are going to have. I mean, everybody's, going to get married or have babies or change their minds or switch advisors or do all these other things. And it's, you got to find your own path, and professors are supposed to be able to, help you. So that's what I thought my job was in part.
Yeah, I think it can be tricky sometimes that, like, often a professor's success rides on, in some ways, whether their grad student remains in the lab and whether that grad student remains in academia, because then that's a potential collaborator down the line that they're tied to and helps them have success. So I think that's sort of another interesting thing to think about. On a slightly different track, I had a great question about, and this is more from, so we have a lot of different constituencies who've been at the workshop over the course of the day, and not all are, PhD students. And so we have one from someone more on the communication side of things, asking sort of suggestions for communications people who want to develop science skills. So what are the ways in which they can develop skills around science, but not necessarily pursue an advanced degree?
I don't think you need skills around science. I mean, you don't need to be able to identify the zooplankton or like do the particle physics. I think what you need is to perhaps one thing that can be beneficial that people who in science communication or science policy who accidentally have advanced degrees can do, but you can do this without an advanced degree, is develop an expertise, is to learn deeply about a topic in a journalism communications kind of way. This is just springing immediately to my mind just because it's my life. And my husband is an energy reporter who covers the EPA. He has no degree of any kind in covering like the details of energy generation and transmission and regulation. But he spent like months learning about it and asking people about it. And now he really understands that. And you can do that with science. And that's what I think, that's what a lot of people, and that's what the vast majority of people who work in science policy, at least on the Hill, do. They have no expertise, but they learn all about it by doing it and by reading about it and by talking to lots of people. And you can do that too.
Yeah, I would say in any new fields, like, so when I went to NASA, I had to learn about the NASA budget process and all these other things, and one of the feedback points I got early from one of my colleagues was, you're asking good questions. Like, why are things like this, and what is this? What is the difference between a requisition and a purchase order, and what's the difference between a commitment and obligation and accrual? There's stuff like this that you're not going to know unless you ask. So you just keep asking good questions, and then you develop the expertise.
So I have a slightly different take. My experience, my life experience has been so heavily influenced by science that I simply can't think outside that box.
Okay. The next question is, what do our panelists think we can do as a community to encourage any science career? So especially not the PhD to tenure track path, but some of these other paths that you guys have all pursued.
One thing that I just learned that is an association now is the Citizen Science Association. So, I mean, citizen scientist is the idea that every citizen should be engaging in science in some ways, and this kind of harkens back to my understanding of the Victorian times in England when everybody had barometers and thermometers and was collecting butterflies and stuff. So there is a citizen science program in Illinois here that's associated with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. So we have Beckman and IGB both share paying for a grad student to help coordinate that stuff. And so here at Beckman, we have a variety of senior citizens who are retired working in labs doing stuff with the professors. So I think in general, I mean, I think it's great to think about every citizen having some kind of scientific interest and activity, whether it's related to wildlife or oceans or energy or solar cells or whatever. That's a great societal value, I think.
Well, I think workshops and panels like this are really helpful. I've been on the other side of this many, many times, and just getting exposure and meeting people who've taken their degree and done different things, I think, is huge, because then you can follow up and learn more. Maybe it has to start from, having, if professors were more, I don't know, maybe knowledgeable or encouraging grad students not just to do their research to get their PhD, but also really think about what do you want to do down the road when you're done? What do you want to do with this degree? Why do you want this degree? And asking those types of questions, having those types of conversations, I think that would be helpful if that was more part of the culture in graduate school. And at the, I don't know if I could speak at the undergraduate level, probably just similar things, just because I think a lot of the career paths out there, when I was blogging about non-traditional careers for chemists, there were so many things I'm like, I just never even thought that you could take your science degree and go do that. If I didn't have that excuse to go and explore all those careers, I wouldn't have known about a lot of them. So I think a lot of it is exposure and just having these types of like forums where you can have those conversations.
So Christine, you actually have a couple of questions that I'm going to ask you next. So again, anyone else can jump in if they want to. Is the uncertainty and internal motivation associated with freelancing, are these things that you thrive on? And were you aware of your like or dislike of uncertainty when you started pursuing journalism? So I think this is really asking about like what that culture and career of journalism is like for you so far.
Sure. I think that I'm similar to George in that I have a short attention span, maybe. I like learning a lot about lots of different things. And I know eventually I want to specialize and figure out what is going to be my area of expertise as a journalist, and I will get there. But for now, I kind of like that. I guess maybe that's a personality thing. I will say, though, that having a staff job as a science writer, there's more stability there, so there's not as much of this, when am I going to get my next writing assignment, and how much am I going to make this month, and having to think about those questions all the time. And then another thing I'll say is I'm in a situation where I have a spouse that can pay the bills, so there's not as much pressure on me to figure out those things, and it would be challenging, I think, if I were supporting myself as a single person or supporting my kids by myself. I think that would change things for me. Not to say that you can't be a freelancer and be a successful freelancer if you're supporting yourself, but I'm just saying that is a thing to consider, because the pay fluctuates, the jobs that you get will depend on if the editors like your ideas in a given month or in a certain time. So, but that is part of my personality to kind of just figure out, what's the next cool thing I want to learn about, and then explore that as a journalist.
And now a question actually for Miriam. How has your training as a scientist contributed to your policymaking role?
I make the best floor charts in Congress with my PowerPoint poster skills. I'm not even kidding. It's a highly valued skill that and my coworkers have no idea why I find this to be hilarious and a little depressing. But they're like, no, this is great. We love this. And can you make some graphs in Excel? And I was like, yes, but yes, I can make graphs in Excel. I can also make graphs in R and MATLAB. Oh. But you actually do. So in terms of the actual skills you develop while while working in science, they are sort of surprisingly applicable, although people also develop them in other ways. Reading a lot of material that is often not the most interesting fast, and understanding it or being able to at least reference it and recall it. Being able to learn new things on your own. And I would add the absolutely critical thing that isn't, unfortunately, doesn't always come with science, that has been the single thing that's benefited me the most, is being able to write. and write to a general audience, and being able to write in a snarky and hilarious manner that I developed through blogging. That is also a very highly valued skill because I do a lot of speech writing, and my boss enjoys being snarky and hilarious. And also, actually, one thing that has happened to me recently is people have started to try to lie to me with data, and they can't do that. So that is an incredibly useful skill that you have as a scientist because most staffers can't call them on that. They won't say, you normalize that to what exactly? Which happened to me the other week. It's amazing what you can make a trend do when you just normalize it to random things. But so people try to lie with data all the time, and if you have science training, they can't do that as easily. So there are all kinds there's so many things that I learned by doing science that are directly applicable to my job on a daily basis. They're just not necessarily the ones that, I spent the most time and value doing when I was a scientist, like statistics and, lab work and things. So I wouldn't say, I'm always very glad I have that training. It is just not the best way to do it on purpose. But if you happen to do it by accident, it's extremely useful.
What's also interesting about what I feel like I'm hearing is that question earlier about, well, what about communicators who want to develop science skills? I actually feel like what you were saying helped me think about what those skills, those specific skills that are broadly applicable would be in terms of ability to visualize data, in terms of ability to analyze data and interpret data. And I think just a broad understanding of the scientific method, those are at least things I'm hearing that you're talking about that would be great skills for any communicator to try to develop.
Oh yeah, I think absolutely. And and also, something that my degree, I almost never do anything in the world of oceanography or even biology necessarily. But the skills of being able to read peer-reviewed papers, which definitely communicators should learn, which is absolutely a difficult to learn and develop skill. Like those things would serve you extremely well. And the rest you can learn. I've learned all about pipeline safety regulation and consumer safety protection and what happens to babies when they eat detergent pods. Don't let them do that. And I have no scientific expertise in any of these areas, but having that technical framework on which to hang totally different things always serves you well.
Any other thoughts on that before I move on? Okay. Actually, one more question for Miriam. How can scientists and science writers best combat bad science ideas coming from Capitol Hill?
Well, I think you should come to my next session. Capitol Hill isn't a thing. There's 500, there's, what is it? Oh God, this is so embarrassing. 535 members, and they all have different perspectives, and some of them are advancing bad science ideas because it advances their political objectives, and what can you do about that? Their political objectives are their political objectives. I actually have some ideas about what you can do about that, but you cannot change it by being not their constituent and being but I have totally the best facts. That's not going to help. Some of them genuinely have a misconception, and that maybe can be cleared up. That's pretty rare. I think the important thing to know about at least Capitol Hill is that the policy is first and the science is usually second. And that is just life. There are many thoughts on how you can make the policy be different policy. Climate change is the obvious example. People are trying very hard on that, but I guess my biggest recommendation is there is no better set of awesome facts or amazing writing or presentation that you can muster that will change anyone's mind who thinks that thinks either deeply and in their heart something, or really thinks their constituents will vote them out of office if they for example, climate change again, if they come out swinging on it. And the two actually specific politicians I'm thinking about that is Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma is a true believer on not believing that climate change is happening. And then former Congressman Bob Inglis from South Carolina, possibly North Carolina. No, I think South Carolina, did get voted out of office for saying that climate change was real. Like, he was voted in with 70% and he lost with 20% of the vote from that one thing. So I just think it's important to understand the atmosphere in which you're operating, but there are things you can do, which we'll talk about later.
And I wonder if we can extend that question to, I'm thinking about, for Patty and George, the fact that you guys have worked at NASA and NIH. Do you have any thoughts from the perspective of having worked at those types of organizations, other thoughts about science, climate, and perceptions of science truthiness or not?
Well, so I was at Ames Research Center, which is a little research center. It's not part of the big behemoth of Marshall or Johnson and Space Flight Center or Kennedy. So certainly within NASA, there's a lot of politics that happens internally because on the one hand, NASA is fortunate to have 10 field centers spread over many states, therefore many congressional districts. Therefore, NASA being healthy is good for a lot of different people who need to get voted into office. But at the same time, NASA's space policy stuff is way down on a list. Okay, people might make nice speeches about it, and sometimes things will change dramatically. But in general, NASA was like half of 1% of the federal budget, $17 billion a year or so. So that's almost not worth talking about for many things. My experience but I did take a lot of training on the Hill, so we learned about a lot of different things. One thing I will say is the congressional staffers who were assigned to the staff committees, like the science committees, those guys are really valid because there's sort of two kinds of staffers. Some are like Miriam, are with an actual Congress or senator person, and the other kinds of staffers are assigned to topics. And so the continuity of understanding about the different science endeavors on the Hill is partly in those committees. And I've seen some of those guys and gals talk, and they're really good. I mean, they're really effective. Like, just think about, are humans going to go to Mars? How do we decide that? And how do we fund research programs to do that? And again, as you were saying, it's not, if we have as an objective, like President Bush started the Constellation program saying, I want to have human Mars missions. And so then the Constellation program was invented at NASA. And so then the program I used to work on was canceled because now the money's going to go there. And we're going to build a really big rocket and a really new crew module and stuff. And then when President Obama came into office, he canceled it. And so now we're doing something else. So one of the big policy questions that space has is, how are we going to have something interesting and exciting enough to span 5 or 6 presidents and about 20 different Congresses so that we'll actually be able to go somewhere? So those kinds of questions make it difficult to deal with this. But I would say that once in a while you would find weird things happen. Like when I was at NASA headquarters for one of my assignments, I was in the Chief Information Officer's office, and so we were the office that got the weird questions from the public sometimes. So we got a letter from a congressman who said, my constituent wrote to me about this question, so I demand that NASA answer it. So, okay, so we read the question. The question is, I read on The Onion that, aliens have been found in New Mexico or something. So somebody had to actually write back very nicely that NASA is the space agency of the United States. We have this research, blah, blah, blah. And The Onion is a satirical newspaper, so it's not real. And so So, and the thing is to me, what happened was, the crazy person writes to the congressman is going to get points by officially referring it to an agency, and we got to handle it. You cannot blow off the congressman when they ask stuff like this.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah. But of the people that I met who were in Congress, I mean, they were usually, good. They asked good questions. But again, like I said, space policy for them is a really minor thing most of the time.
So, NIH is actually a collection of institutes, each of which has its own policy office. So no single person or office is in charge of policy at NIH, and that allows all the voices to be heard, and the organization was generally tolerant of dissenting voices. So in the occasions that my office was asked to provide data to support one or another policy question, the data was usually examined by a bunch of different people, and then any policy suggestions were fiercely debated, and then something bubbled up from that. So even though it was a government organization, I think the NIH experience might be slightly different from some of the other agencies.
I I would also generally say it seems like if you could encourage Congress to always support peer-reviewed science instead of doing like earmarks to fund some weird pet project from somebody, that seems like that's a much better approach, right? As long as you keep things, and I guess with the demise, as if earmarks have kind of gone down, I thought, yeah. So as earmarks go away, then you maybe have less of a problem with bad science.
There's no more earmarks, but the current chairman of the science committee has actually taken on to attacking the peer review process itself at NSF. So unfortunately, it's not has not had that effect. Yeah, but I would actually also just echo the fact that space and science are like theoretically important to a lot of members, but when it comes down to serious budgetary questions, they are for most members not in their top 5.
So one of the interesting things, so in this panel, we have certainly not representation of all possible science careers, but we have at least some decent representation, right? In terms of policy, journalism, we have industry, we have federally funded organizations, and also staying within academia, but not necessarily always pursuing a faculty gig. I'm kind of wondering if you guys have, having some perspective on starting to be on the other side of it or being on the other side of it, what kind of advice you would have for young PhD students, given what you see as the job climate? Because we spend a lot of time talking about how terrible the job climate is for people who stay in academia, but it's probably worth considering the many different types of the many different job climates for science PhD students. So sort of, can any of you speak to that a little bit?
Develop alternative plans and skills actively. Best thing I ever accidentally did, and all the many things I've accidentally done, was all the science blogging, which has led directly to my current job. Who knew? I just thought it would be fun to write about science on the internet. But definitely think about all your full skill set and what you like to do, and even if it's not directly related to your research field, chances are like that those other things might come in handy.
One thing that as a manager at NASA, I went to a number of career fairs where you were trying to recruit people, and I was struck by this, that the first time I did this, I think it was at Stanford, I'm at a table with the HR people and me as a line manager, and students would come up and say, oh, I'm an international student, and they would just say, you can't work at NASA, go away. And I'm like, what? So what they meant was, if you want to be hired as a federal civil servant at NASA, you have to be a US citizen. But most of NASA is contracted out. So most of the people that work on a NASA center are contractors with SAIC or Lockheed Martin or Boeing or something. And so you can certainly get hired through them. So another thing that would help. So then I started seeing those guys and saying, hey, hang on a second, go to the Boeing booth over there, or the Lockheed Martin booth over there, and you might be able to be working on space missions and their aerospace missions. So it's not just, so I found this to be, maybe helpful for people to know that there's a big difference between, working as a federal civil servant like I was versus being a contractor. You can still do, great stuff either way, and it's actually more flexible probably in the contractor side.
I think I'm probably still too new to speak to the overall, big picture job market in journalism, but I'll just say that there are many different types of science communication. So even I think I saw some Pew Research data that showed like there are 3-to-1 ratio of PR jobs to journalism in the science writing world. So even if journalism, when I tell people I'm going into, I wanted to go into journalism, they're like, well, isn't journalism dying? Well, that's an argument, a whole nother separate discussion. I would argue that it's changing. It's not going away. It certainly is changing the way people are changing the way they get their information and their news. But one thing I would just say is that even if, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Even though if you're interested in science writing, there are lots of different avenues to pursue. There's not just journalism. Journalism is like one specific area in this bigger umbrella of science communication, and there are several science writers in the audience, I'm aware. And I guess for me, I thought initially, well, since my background's in chemistry, I should just stick to writing in chemistry magazines. And since I have a PhD, I should stick to writing for, scientific audiences. And then I've slowly just kind of realized, what I really like doing is writing about, more like general interest topics in science and health. And I really like this radio stuff. And I've heard multiple times, radio is really tough. General audiences, it's really tough market. But I'm like, but this is what I really want to do. So I'm going to try to find a way to make it happen. So I can't really speak to the big picture. Like, yeah, maybe that's where the jobs are really scarce, but that's the direction I want to move. So I'm just trying my best to get to where I want to be, because I feel like I can't settle for doing something that I'm not really passionate about, or that my heart's not really into. So I just, that's been my general approach to navigating my career. It's like, I'm not going to settle for something just because I think something's out of my reach doesn't mean I'm not going to try to go for it and see if that's an opportunity. And that's the advice that I like to give to people, even though maybe that's not rooted in I don't know, like what's the reality possibly, but that's the advice I like to give.
Christine, one question I have for you, actually, though there's probably multiple responses to this, is one of the things that's kind of interesting about, and this is something that came up for those of you here who are workshop attendees, one of the things that came up earlier was talking about the fact that a lot of scientists are afraid of marring their scientific reputation if they give the appearance of caring about outreach or engagement. And I've also heard that and experienced that directly, where scientists are often hesitant to talk to journalists because either their story is going to get disrupted, like somebody's going to screw up their science or misquote them or misuse what they have to say, or it's going to make them look bad that there's someone who's willing to talk to journalists, that there's sort of that, some of that is stuff that some people feel in some subdisciplines in science they kind of have to climb through. But as someone who's been on both sides of it, what do you have to say for some of the scientists here, as well as maybe for some of the various types of communicators in terms of how we can overcome some of those miscommunications?
That's a really important question. Okay, so I guess for scientists, I don't necessarily blame a lot of scientists when they're hesitant to talk to a journalist, because when you're a scientist and you're talking to a journalist, you're kind of trusting them to get it right and to put it out there for the world to see and not mess it up. And as we all know, that there are often errors especially in more technical or scientific types of stories. So I understand the hesitation that scientists have. I try to work with them. I try to say, well, if I have any question at all about, this, or if I'm going to paraphrase something you say, I'll probably, call you back or send you an email, make sure, that I'm getting this right, and I will do that. And different news organizations will have different policies on if you can go back to your sources to show them your story before it runs. But there are ways, I feel like, if I have a conversation with them to clarify something, I'm not showing them the whole story so that they can try to change it or change something they said, but I'm just trying to make sure that I'm getting the facts straight. So as a communicator, I feel like that's important to kind of assure the scientists, like, if I have any question at all, I'm going to come back to you to make sure I get it right. As a scientist, I would say, you can ask those questions, find out how much, back and forth you can have to make sure that you're explaining something correctly. So since, I kind of jumped from the lab into, journalism before I really had a whole lot of extensive science, a science career, I can't speak so much to, advice to the scientists, but maybe some of you who have could chime in on that part.
So I think that an essential part of being a scientist is being able to communicate your ideas to non-scientists as well. And a wonderful example of that would be Harold Varmus when he was the NIH director. I mean, he would go onto Capitol Hill and charm both sides of the aisle because he could speak so clearly about why what NIH did was important. And you can see some of that if you read his book. I think it's called The Art and Politics of Science. It's a wonderful reading if you haven't looked at it yet. But yes, so communication extremely important.
Oh, I'd just like to share a story. When I was in one of my NASA leadership classes, I was talking to a guy who was a division chief at Johnson Space Center, and he seemed like your classic, crusty, Gene Kranz looking guy who was like really conservative. But we were talking about communication. He's like, I think every single person who works at NASA should be able to communicate to the general public. Like every single one of us should be part of the Speakers Bureau. Every single one of us should go out to our Kiwanis clubs and our houses of worship and the farmers market and whatever and communicate what we're doing because it's amazing. And so many people are either think they're not supposed to or they're too tired or something. But I was really encouraged by that because he had this great attitude about we should put it out there, absolutely. It's a wonderful thing.
Pretty much almost everything that we get that the members read, if they're not on one of the relevant committees or have a particular passion, is filtered through the media. So if you want your science to matter in policy, it behooves you to learn how to talk to journalists.
I have what I think is kind of a fun question here by another person on Twitter. What job, other than your own, do you think would be really cool in science or communication, and why? So I guess this is like an alternate reality question. If you were pursuing a different path within the realm of science, what might be another path that you would have also considered? I'll let you free write. We can do a think, pair, share. Everybody sit and free write for a minute.
I really liked my zooplankton. I miss them. I mean, I still have like experiments in my head that I think I would still really like to do, and like particular critters that I would like to learn about. And I think I would have been pretty happy doing that, but given a different set of logistics.
Actually, I was talking about this with my sister, the chemistry professor, and we both kind of said, if we were doing it over, we would both be interested in working on environmental science and focusing on water and having, not just, doing basic chemistry of water, but thinking about the systems with which you could support every life on Earth with better water supplies. So, I mean, that's sort of a great noble goal and a lot of cool technology and science underneath it, too.
If I had to do it all over again, I'd study computer science and math instead of biology.
I honestly don't know what I would change. I think I'm pursuing this because this is the one thing I really want to be doing, so.
Great. How can science or scientists or science writers best inspire the public to care about good science?
Well, I think one classic engineering example is, you can show horrifying disasters based on engineering mistakes, and that will help you motivate you to say, why did this happen, and how can we not have this happen again? So when I was at NASA, I was on 2 mishap investigation boards. Both were missions that no human lives were involved. It was the Genesis probe that crashed in 2004, and the Orbiting Carbon Observatory that failed on launch in 2009. And again, you're not talking about loss of life or loss of crew, loss of mission, but you are talking about $200 million of something that's gone. So, and there's a really very rigorous process that NASA undergoes to do a mishap investigation. It's very much like the NTSB, and it's not about blaming the person. In fact, NASA defines a successful investigation as when you identify the root cause as organizational. That you say it's either this center or the NASA agency itself needs to fix this policy or this practice or this procedure, because it's not just enough to say that part failed. It's like, well, how did you decide to buy that part? Why did you design that? What's it made out of? And how did you qualify it? And how did you test it? So all these questions get asked in these very rigorous investigations. So, or if you're a civil engineering student, you've probably seen the famous Tacoma Narrows Bridge video where the bridge starts to buckle and it falls apart. I mean, so I think there's a lot of things like that where you're like, it's horrifying that that stuff could have happened, and it should never happen again. And so that's, to me, is a great motivator for a lot of things.
I don't know that most people think of science as a category. Exactly. They think of like health, like what do I do for my health, or other aspects that directly relate to their lives. So I think it's sort of meeting people where they are and seeing how science helps make those determinations rather than good science as a category.
I would just echo what Miriam just said. Like, I feel like if I believe something's important, and then I need to convince people of its importance. And as a science writer, that's not necessarily my job to convince the public that something's important. But obviously, I think science is important, and that's why I want to cover it. But I think also, that's been something that I feel like is more of a challenge now that I'm trying to move towards more, general audiences. It's like, well, are people going to care about this topic? And if it has a direct link, like through health or through medicine, that's usually, those are the easier stories to show those connections. Some of the more maybe abstract science, it can be more tough to do that. But I think, well, if this is something that I feel is important, then that's the challenge I feel like I have, is to show other people why it is important.
I'm curious if you guys can share maybe what some of your proudest career moments have been. I know you guys are, again, there's a lot of range in terms of seniority and stuff, and so maybe more years of experience to think from than others, but like, what are some moments that you've been really proud of, the kinds of career decisions you've made or things that you've done?
I can tell you about one sort of exciting experience, and it came of going to my boss's office and saying I was bored and I needed something else to do. And he said, well, I've got the project for you. We just got a call from the White House, and we've been told to put a team together and implement one aspect of the Affordable Care Act, which was a tax credit program run by the IRS, where NIH was to do the peer review in 2 months' time, which is near impossible. So because of that, I got thrown into this interagency team that was run out of the Department of Health and Human Services, and we worked 24/7 for 2 months, and we would get calls from the White House every second day asking why there wasn't more progress. And I got to work with some super people who worked incredibly hard, people who made things happen that everyone else thought was impossible, and we actually pulled it off 3 weeks ahead of schedule. And I just realized how many wonderful people there are in the federal government who never get praised for the things they do well, but are constantly being pointed at for all the things that don't work. So, and then that was a great experience, and sort of made all the years at NIH seem wonderful.
I guess when I decided to go freelance this year, I set a goal at the beginning of the year, like by the end of this year, I want to do a public radio story on a health topic. And I thought, okay, that's an ambitious goal for me just starting out as a freelancer. So when I pitched an idea to the local radio station, and then my story aired last month, that was a pretty proud moment for me, because I was really happy with how it turned out, and that's the first time I've ever heard my voice on the radio. Because even though I did an internship last year, I was writing scripts, and then the producers were, reading and producing the story. So it was the first time that it was like I was actually reporting this story, my own story. So I don't know, that was a pretty proud moment for me, and not that I've arrived, but I feel like I'm on the path, in the direction I want to be going, and I'm pretty excited about that.
Well, I'll talk about a significant moment. I don't know if about, triumphant or good, but so the Columbia accident happened in January 2003. That's when I had been in NASA for about a year and a half. And so, that was horrifying. I mean, I remember when Challenger failed in 1986, but a lot of the younger people at NASA didn't actually remember that happening. So that led to a huge amount of change internal to NASA. And if you followed any of the space stuff, Diane Vaughan, who's a sociologist, I think, has a book called The Challenger Launch Decision. And one of the things she talks about there is the culture of deviance at NASA, about how we articulate risks and we, over time, decide they were acceptable because, this bad thing never happened, 100 times later, it never happened, yes, it's been okay. And you should never kind of get that complacent about managing risks. So I remember that the day that happened, I was supposed to go off on this social thing on the weekend, and didn't. We were all staying home and watching it. Then we all came to work on Monday, and we're all trying to figure out what we can do. Ames's role in the Columbia Mishap Investigation Board was to help put IT tools together for the team. So there was a team that went down to Houston and Kennedy to organize information about the investigation. And so a number of my people were involved directly in dealing with that. And then the guy who was the director of the whole recovery effort came to Ames later as our deputy center director. And so he was an amazing person. It was really heartbreaking to hear about what he had to deal with. But the other thing that happened out of all this was NASA developed this internal thing called the NASA Engineering and Safety Center. And we fought and won to have a human factors person be in that structure. So just saying that people make mistakes, therefore things are going to happen is not acceptable either. That's our whole research agenda, is to understand the causes and consequences of so-called human error and how do you design systems so you minimize those things. And I'm really proud of the person that I chose to go be the first NASA Engineering and Safety Center Human Factors Technical Fellow. She is still there. She is a she. She was the only woman on that board when it got started. And she is, tremendously knowledgeable and very aggressive. And she's just, it's wonderful to see her in action and corral everybody else to think about safety first when they're doing stuff. Whether it's having JPL put in couches and nap rooms for their 24/7 launch control people, or it's going down to the shuttle assembly facility and figuring out why is foam spraying so hard to do and how can you deal with it more effectively. So that was a tough thing to go through, but I think that NASA's a much better organization now because of that.
One of the advantages for working for an awesome member of Congress is you can sort of react to things and bring attention to things that need to be brought attention to. So it's actually directly relevant to the goals of this conference. So when a really great paper on sexual harassment came out in the Sciences, along with a really unfortunate cover in Science, which was the headless transgender women cover, I talked to my boss about it, and she's like, yeah, well, we should write a letter to AAAS and tell them that Science has a sexism problem and look what you just did. And then, she wrote this letter to the president of AAAS, who then came in and was like, yeah, I'm super sorry, that won't happen again, and we've put in these internal measures. We actually, in our office, my boss does not think sufficient internal measures, but they at least had to come in and directly explain to a member of Congress why they made that decision and also how they were dealing with general sexism in science. So that was very satisfying. And you can do things like that if you, not just specific to these topics, but if you time them correctly and target the right people, it can be extremely satisfying to either force perhaps some other unreflective institutions, either governmental or not, to reflect or to advocate for more specific changes.
So I have another question that's another one that I think all of you could potentially answer, and it's sort of come up a couple different times indirectly, but I'm curious if any of you can speak about, I hate to use that term work-life balance, so instead I'll talk about maybe the range of things that is important to a person's life besides their careers, so the elders in their lives, any spouses or partners they may have, offspring, hobbies, pets, there are many, many things that make a rich life, and I'm wondering whether, juggling some of the, what it's been like for you guys juggling all those different considerations.
Okay, so I'm old relative to you guys. So I have 3 kids who are 15, almost 14, and 9. When I was a professor before I got married, I was working all the time, and once I got tenure, I could relax a little bit. So that's a huge thing. But so basically, I waited until I was tenured and married, and then I had my kids. So I had my kids between the ages of 35 and 40, which worked out fine for me. Other people can't do that. And in terms of balancing stuff, once I had children, that's when I stopped working at all the nights and weekends all the time. It's like, I know I can always have things to do every night and weekend, but I'm just not going to do it. I'm going to have to be more efficient and get the key stuff done. And I'm going home at 5, and I'm going to, do family stuff. And my job here at Beckman is really great. It's amazing. It's wonderful to be the associate director of research here. And again, I still have kind of 8 to 5-ish hours most of the time. Once in a while, I have to work late, but basically having that kind of schedule enables me to, balance my life the way I want to do it. So, so I found that that kind of general schedule is just the thing I need to be able to balance things right.
The hours in Congress are sort of considered hard, but I actually think it's way easier than grad school, to be honest. It can be late nights on occasion, but if there's not a particular reason, then there isn't. I don't feel like there's quite as much. There's always work, but it's not. I don't know. Maybe it's because it's not as personal to me as finishing a PhD. I don't find it as stressful. I've already spoken about the location issues, though. So that the location, which was what was really important to me and my husband, was finding a place that we would stay, that we could both have careers that we liked. So DC has worked out well for us. We are expecting 2 simultaneous additions to the household in July, so we'll see how that goes. It'll be an adventure.
I like that the career I'm in allows for some flexibility, because I knew that when I was thinking I wanted to be a professor and do research, the big question is always, well, when should you have your kids? Some people wait till they're tenured. Some, say, well, you should just have your kids and then make life work around it. And I was always like, well, it's going to be a hard path. So when I learned that in science writing, if there's flexibility, not just day to day as a freelancer, I get to, make my own schedule, set my own hours, but also over the course of a career, there's some flexibility. Like if you step off the track for a little bit, as long as you kind of keep your connections and keep your skills fresh, like you can get back in. And that's not the case not often the case, I feel like, in academia. Like if you take a year off to, be home with your baby or something like that, you would have some hurdles to get over to try to get back in. So that's one thing that did appeal to me when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do that didn't involve doing research. And when I learned that there would be that there's that, more of that type of flexibility, that was certainly appealing to me. I have 2 kids, under the age 2 and under right now. So as a freelancer right now, I'm at a stage in my life where I'm not working full-time hours right now, but maybe when they're older, I'll try to ramp up a little more, and that's kind of how I'm approaching it.
So I tend to work really long hours because whatever I do interests me. And when the hours become too long, then I start forgetting, and I become less efficient at what I do. And I've trained myself over the years to recognize when I've hit that point, and then I take a week's vacation and start all over again. But in general, my days are really long. They start at 6 in the morning, they end up late at 9 or 10 at night, and I punctuate them with small gaps as I need them. But whatever I do interests me so much that I can't stop doing it.
So we are just about out of time. Are there any last questions from the floor that anyone wanted to ask? Okay, well then, thank you again to our wonderful panelists, and thank you to everyone for coming.